Tief is a German artist who lives or lived for a long time in the south of France, where he bought a giant piece of land on which there was an old factory. I don't know what kind of factory, but let's say an old concrete factory or something. And he used the machines and the holes and the whole plant to build his giant installations, like these towers. And these towers he calls Jericho towers, after the biblical story of the march round the walls of Jericho, and 7 times round the walls of Jericho, and the walls collapse because God makes them collapse. And he's fascinated by this vanity and also by this angry God who makes these buildings, these walls collapse. So he builds these fragile towers in this landscape, in this industrial landscape, which is of course very interesting. There's a documentary about him which I can greatly recommend by this person, Sophie Jen, I think you pronounce it. Over your cities grass will grow, which is of course also from the Bible. I think it's from Josiah. Over your cities grass will grow, a prophecy. And in this documentary he says in one of the interviews that he is so fascinated not only by this mortality of culture, but also what happens next. And he says Lilith, there she is again, she hides in ruins. Now last time we talked about Lilith. She was, according to some Jewish traditions, the first wife of Adam, before he had Eve. And they were created equal. Eve was created from Adam's rib, but Lilith and Adam were created from the same clay. Why there is such a tradition? Well, very easy. In the book of Genesis, in the Old Testament, man is created twice. The act of creation is narrated twice. So when people started thinking about this, they started saying, well, then Adam was there, and since there's 2 times a creation, there must have been 2 wives. So what happened to the first? So they created this narration about an evil wife of Adam, and later the good Eve. And why is Eve good? Because she listens to everything that Adam says. And why is Lilith bad? Because she doesn't listen anytime to anything that he said. And she didn't want to be dominated in any way. And of course her person is, for all kinds of reasons, very interesting. One of them is that she leaves paradise voluntarily. Adam and Eve are expelled from paradise, but Lilith, she walks out of paradise because she doesn't want to remain in that place. And she shouts at God while walking away. She shouts at God and she pronounces his most secret name, which no mortal may ever pronounce. This is almost like building a tower to the heaven. God doesn't want us to become too close, and certainly not pronounce his name. And this is what Lilith does. And because of this, he makes her a demon. An immortal and unhappy demon is, of course, a fatal combination. And she lives in ruins, according to this Jewish tradition, and she thinks about her evil acts. And Kiefer is fascinated by this. He builds ruins for Lilith, where Lilith can live, because he's fascinated by this Lilith figure. So he's fascinated, yeah, of course he is. So you see how this web of stories can be woven infinitely and how artists can take it up. Let me now give you another version of this same story. And then we come back at Gilgamesh again. At any rate, an eagle nursed a baby. When Iakoros, strange name, was king of the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, which are kind of prophecy priests, foretold that the son born of his daughter would wrest the kingdom from his grandfather. So the familiar story. This made him shiver with fear, and if I may be allowed to, the small jest, he played Acrisius, the grandfather of Perseus, who was also the hero in such a story, to his daughter. He put the strictest of watches upon her, yet the daughter gave birth to a child, for fate outwitted the Babylonian, being pregnant by some obscure man. So the guards, from fear of the king, hurled the infant from the citadel, for that was where the aforesaid daughter was imprisoned, the sorcerer's tower, as we saw. Now the eagle, which saw with its piercing eye the child was still falling, before the baby would be dashed to the earth, flew beneath it and flung its back under it and conveyed it to some garden and set it down with the utmost care. Well, the caretaker of the place, when seeing the pretty baby, fell in love with it and nursed it, and it was called Gilgamos, the Greek version of Gilgamesh, the only text in antiquity that preserves the name of Gilgamesh. And it was king of the Babylonians. If anyone regards this as a mere story, I, after testing it to the best of my ability, do not agree with the verdict. And now he comes with another story, very interestingly. Indeed, I hear that Achaemenus, from the Achaemenids, the Persian, from which the Persian nobility are descended, was the nursling of an eagle. Ha, interesting. So the Persians told about the founder of their dynasty, the Achaemenids, this same story, which was told apparently about Gilgamesh. They told it about Achaemenus, that he was the nursling of an eagle. And for those of you, it's probably the majority, who know the Shahnameh, there is of course a story very like it in the Shahnameh. The story of Zal, who was of course nurtured by the Seymour. But there are many other versions of it. This is not just an Iranian tradition, but as I said, this is a quite widespread tradition in the ancient world. So even Gilgamesh, our great hero Gilgamesh, who appears in an epic with a quite different story, was also part of this more popular fairy tale. And this is of course the point where I want to get to. Now before I do take a brief break, if you allow me, I will give you one more example of this story, and after the break I will go to Gilgamesh and show you again how effective it is because it is in our minds, so much that we can play with it and that the director can play with it. This is a still from the movie L'Innocente, The Innocent, of Visconti, the famous Italian director Visconti, from 1976, after a novel by D'Annunzio. And it is a story set in 19th century Italy in higher class circles. It's about members of the nobility, shown here, they're married, and their marriage is failing. And he cheats on her. He has a mistress, a very beautiful, talented, interesting mistress, and his wife is also very beautiful and intelligent and gifted in all kinds of ways, and yet he cheats on her. This in itself is portrayed in a very sensitive way. It is not portrayed in a sort of black and white way. And we follow him. He's a difficult person. And we also see that at some point he realizes that this is not what he wants. And not only does he ask his wife for forgiveness, but he falls in love with her again. And this is shown by Visconti in an incredibly convincing way. It is shown in their summer residence, and with light colors, light clothes, whatever, and he really falls in love with her in the most desperate way. In the most desperate way. And she is distant. This is the still from that scene. And yet, she goes with it. You feel that maybe she's afraid that he's not completely sincere, but she goes more and more with it. And then one day there's an incredible tragedy, because she discovers that she's pregnant, and the baby cannot be from him. And she has had, apparently, in this period of separation, a lover of her own. And now she's pregnant. They are in love again, and yet she has the sign, the physical sign of their previous separation in her. And what happens then is that they sort of conspire against this unborn child. Because they are so in love again, they don't want this child. And when it is born, they don't look at it. They give it to a nurse, they don't look at it. They don't look at it. And she tells him that she hates the child. That she really hates the child, that she doesn't want to see him. And then it's Christmas Eve. And it is snowing and it is cold. He's an atheist, so he doesn't go. And she goes with her mother-in-law, with the rest of the family, the servants. They have a chapel near their castle or whatever it is. And he's the only one who doesn't go, and he remains in the house with the child. And then he exposes the child in the snow, let's say in the wilderness. But in this case, the child does not survive. It dies. And then when she comes back and the child is dead, there is an incredibly nightmarish revelation for him, because he did something to save their love. And she tells him that she hates him and that she was only pretending to hate the child to protect it from him. And then you suddenly realize that the director Visconti and also the writer of the novel, D'Annunzio, have been using this fairy tale. In the fairy tale, he is the grandfather, and she is as the daughter who becomes pregnant by some obscure man, and he feels threatened by the child because he fears that it will take his place in her love, and that's why he wants to kill it. And the reason why why this movie that uses these patterns that we are all so familiar with, why it is so terrible to see, because it is really terrible to see, is exactly because it uses these familiar patterns, but it also abuses them by letting the child really die. Okay, let's take a break.